Welcome to lecture 7. This is the first of 3 lectures about the mood spectrum, the mood disorders. Today's lecture and tomorrow's lecture, or whenever you happen to watch the next lecture, lecture 8, are going to mostly focus on unipolar depression. So today we're going to introduce the mood spectrum and then start talking about unipolar depressive disorder. So we'll talk about the unipolar depressive diagnoses in the DSM. And then we'll start to talk about the heterogeneity of major depression. The etiology of major depression we're actually going to talk about in the next lecture, along with treatment. So what is mood? Mood is sustained and pervasive, and it influences the way that we react to life events. Affect, by contrast, it refers to behaviors that reflect our current emotional state. So mood and emotion are not the same thing. Emotions are kind of a byproduct of mood, but also of the environment. So mood refers to our overall emotional tendency, whether we're more likely to experience positive or negative emotions overall across the course of a day. Mood is longer lasting, and emotions tend to be transient, short-lived, reactive to the environment. And then affect is sort of the behavioral, measurable, observable impact of our emotions. So another way that I like to think about this and explain it to patients is that mood is kind of like the emotional climate, and affect is like the weather. So in the summer, especially here, it's likely to be hot most of the time. So the climate in the summer is hot, but that doesn't mean that the weather is exactly the same every day. Sometimes it rains, sometimes it's sunny, sometimes it's hotter than others. So affect changes day to day and moment to moment, whereas mood kind of remains the same over time. How long a mood lasts varies, but one of the things that makes a mood disorder or a mood episode deviant in the psychopathology sense is that it lasts longer than moods typically do, and it's less responsive to changes in the environment than moods typically are. Okay, so I just tried to explain that, but I'm going to let Stephen Fry try to explain it a little bit better. Stephen Fry is a comedian and writer, really smart guy who has talked a lot about his diagnosis with a bipolar spectrum disorder, but here he's mostly just talking about what mood means to him.
Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder rather than a personality disorder, such as that might be for anybody, but I think we'll kind of get what that is. To me, mood is the equivalent of weather. Weather is real. That's the important thing to remember about weather. It is absolutely real. When it rains, it rains. It is wet, you get wet. There's no question about it. It's also true about weather that you can't control it. You can't say, if I wish hard enough, it won't rain. Equally true. But if the weather's bad, one day it will get better. And what I had to learn was to treat my moods like the weather. On the one hand, denying that they were there, saying I'm not really depressed, because why should I be depressed? I've got enough money, I've got a job, people like me. There's no reason to be depressed. That's as stupid as saying there's no reason to have asthma, there's no reason to have measles. You've got it. It's there. It's not about reason. You don't get depressed because bad things happen to you. That's getting pissed off and annoyed. That's reasonable. Someone hits you in the face, you go, ow! But depression is something that happens like weather to you inside you. And it's not about, it can be triggered by something unfortunate, but it isn't, it's not enough to talk yourself out of it by saying, well, I shouldn't be depressed because I've got people who are nice to me, which is frustrating for people outside. They go, don't be depressed, everyone loves you, you're really happy, you've got a good life. I know, that's what's so depressing, I can't help it.
Okay, so he uses the weather and mood analogy a little bit differently than I just did, because affect is kind of a technical term. But basically what he's saying is that basically what he's saying is that mood states are real. They have a real impact on obviously how you feel and how you go about your life. But the frustrating thing about them for people who don't experience them is that they don't seem to be closely tied to what's happening in your life. They're not responsive to changes in your environment. And as he said, mood episodes are often triggered by experiences, usually negative ones, but the key is that they're not proportionate reactions to negative experiences, and they last longer than moods typically do. So mood, we think of mood as existing on a spectrum, ranging from really sad to really happy. In the middle is a mood state known as euthymia, which is where most of us exist most of the time. Euthymia just refers to being okay or fine. When someone is euthymic, they don't feel particularly happy or sad, but they're capable of feeling happy or sad if something good or negative happens to them. Euthymic mood, happiness, and sadness are sort of in the range of normal emotional fluctuations. Sad mood is what you might experience if you're not having a major depressive episode when something bad or negative happens to you. You would feel sad if you didn't do well in an exam or if you had a fight with a friend. You would feel happy if something good happened to you, like if you got a job that you really wanted. So when you're in a euthymic, non-depressed, non-manic mood state, you can become sad or happy based on things that happen to you. We'll touch more on this when we talk about bipolar disorders and the bipolar spectrum, but both ends of the mood spectrum, so really severe depression and really severe mania, can be accompanied by psychosis, which just refers to altered mental state. And they can actually both be accompanied by suicide. It should say suicide over here too. Both severe depression and severe mania are risk factors for suicide. And we'll talk about suicide in lecture 9, 2 lectures from now. Okay, so when we talk about mood episodes, these are clinical entities. So they're in the DSM, there are criteria that someone has to meet to be diagnosed for the current mood episode. And today we're going to be talking exclusively about depressive episodes. But when you have a depressive episode, your mood ranges typically from mild depression to very severe depression. And you're in that mood state most of the time, kind of regardless of what's happening to you in the outside world. A manic episode refers to anything ranging from hypomania, which I'll define in a second, to full-blown mania. A hypomanic episode is kind of a light manic episode. It has all the same symptoms, but they're just less severe. And the impairment from it tends to be much less. Hypomania in and of itself isn't actually impairing. So that's what this is showing here. When people are in a hypomanic episode, they actually tend to feel really good and they're often really productive and really happy. And if they could exist in a hypomanic episode all the time, most of us would choose to, but it is an altered mood state and people typically don't have hypomanic episodes without also being very prone to experiencing depressive episodes or even full-blown mania. And then lastly, another type of mood episode that again we'll mostly talk about in lecture 9 is a mixed episode, where people experience one predominant mood episode, so mostly mania or mostly depression. They meet full criteria for that mood episode, but they also experience significant symptoms of the opposite end of the mood spectrum. Okay, so obviously, mood disorders affect your mood. They affect how you feel, they affect the emotions that you tend to have. They are the emotional climate that affects the emotional weather. In depression, mood is sad and anhedonic, which we'll define in a second. And in mania, mood is elevated and excited and happy, although not all the time. Depression and mania, so the far ends of the mood spectrum, though, also affect basically all of our important biological functions. They affect sleep, appetite, and energy as key, core symptoms of these 2 different mood episodes. So interestingly, and as we'll talk about a lot in this lecture, depression symptoms can be a little bit less specific than manic symptoms. So in mania, people experience a decreased need for sleep. People usually only need to sleep 3 or 4 hours a night when they're manic to feel fully rested. And sometimes they'll just go completely without sleeping. In depression, people experience either insomnia or hypersomnia, which is sleeping a lot, or sometimes both at different times. And insomnia is different than decreased need for sleep because people who are experiencing insomnia really want to sleep. They feel tired. They feel like they're not rested at all after 4 hours of sleep, but they just can't fall asleep or stay asleep. Again, in mania, people tend to experience a loss of appetite. And it's not that they don't enjoy food and eating or they don't want to eat. They just don't need to. They have a lot of energy that doesn't come from sleeping or eating. In depression, people might experience either a loss or an increase in appetite. But with depression, again, it's not that they don't feel the need to eat. They really just don't want to eat. They don't feel hungry. They don't enjoy anything. They don't want to eat, but they experience the negative physiological consequences of not eating. which people don't really do in mania. Alternatively, people with depression can sometimes experience increases in appetite where they eat a lot, their food choices change, so they might eat a lot of like high carb comfort foods and sugar. So again, depression can either involve loss or increase in appetite. Depression and mania both affect energy, and here the effects on energy are opposite because there's a difference between psychomotor retardation and agitation and just energy. So fatigue just refers to feeling tired all the time, feeling like you don't have the physical strength and stamina to do daily activities that you need to do. That is a symptom of depression. And by contrast, people who are manic experience lots and lots of energy. And their excessive energy is kind of the reason why they experience a decreased need for sleep and a decreased need to eat. Psychomotor effects of mood episodes are really severe and kind of rare, especially in depression. So what psychomotor means is that it's not just experienced, it's not a subjective state, it's an objective state where someone is physically slowed down. Their reaction time is slower. If you threw a ball at their head, they couldn't dodge it in time. Psychomotor agitation also is a physiological state where people are extremely restless and can't stop moving around. And that state can occur in depression and in mania. The only difference is that in mania, people would only experience psychomotor agitation and not psychomotor retardation. Cognition, so our ability and efficiency to think, is affected by our mood states. So here the effects are pretty opposite. In depression, people feel like their thinking is slowed down. They feel like they have trouble making decisions. They feel indecisive. They feel like it's physically harder to concentrate and to think. Whereas people who are having a manic episode experience what's known as flight of ideas, where they're having tons of thoughts. They're thinking really fast. They subjectively think that they're being like really brilliant and insightful, although to an outside observer, a lot of the ideas that they're coming up with might not make a lot of sense, but their brain is working really fast. And in depression, you feel like your brain is working really slow. Mania and depression have opposite impacts on self-image and self-esteem, the way that we view and experience ourselves in the world. So when people are manic, they tend to be really grandiose. They think that they're the best thing ever. They think that all their ideas are brilliant. They think that they're an amazing artist or writer or entrepreneur. People who are in a manic episode tend to pursue a lot of projects and get really excited about things because they think that everything they're doing is great. By contrast, people who are depressed feel worthless. They feel really low self-esteem. They feel guilty and like they're being punished for kind of every perceived wrongdoing that they could have done, way out of proportion to like an outside observer's perception of whether or not they deserve to be punished. Mania and depression also have opposite impacts on social and sexual functioning. Only sexual functioning is here, but social functioning is usually affected too. So when people are depressed, they tend to withdraw socially and they tend to lose interest in sex. They just don't have a libido in the same way that they might lose their appetite. They just don't want to. By contrast, people who are having a manic episode can become really outgoing and social more than they usually are. And hypersexuality, so having a really high sex drive and engaging in a lot of sexual behavior, is a symptom of mania or a feature of mania. So in this lecture, we're going to start by just kind of defining the unipolar depressive diagnoses, starting with major depressive disorder, and then working our way through a couple diagnostic specifiers for major depressive disorder and two separate diagnoses outside of major depressive disorder. So complicated grief is not currently a recognized diagnosis in the DSM, but it is diagnosable as depression, and we'll talk about what the differences are in a couple slides. Seasonal affective disorder is a subtype of major depressive disorder. Okay. So Vincent van Gogh is someone who's often used as an example of depression and mania. We can't diagnose him. He was never diagnosed using our modern diagnostic classifications, but he definitely seemed to experience some significant depressive episodes that he described and wrote about in letters to his brother. So during one depressive episode, he wrote about being angry with himself because he couldn't do what he wanted to do. At such a moment, one feels as if one were lying bound hand and foot at the bottom of a deep, dark well, utterly helpless. So depression makes it hard to do things. It saps your motivation, and it makes you feel like you're not good at things, like your efforts are not going to be worthwhile. And cognitively, it's just harder to get your brain to work when you're feeling depressed. It's harder to do effortful tasks, both because of fatigue and because of cognitive impairment. So a more probably relatable experience of this is just kind of difficulty getting out of bed, not feeling motivated to do things, feeling more motivated to do things that are pleasurable or relaxing, and just having a harder time doing things that are less enjoyable. So this is, I'm just going to play a brief part of this clip of a woman, a college student, kind of just articulating her internal monologue during a time when she realizes that she's sort of at the beginning of a major depressive episode.
You can kind of see me. I just got out of the shower. I forced myself in the shower because I'm not going to sit here and must all day. I had to figure out what I want to wear to be productive the rest of the night, because I pretty much slept on and off all day, so I know I'm going to be up till 3 a.m. Trying to figure out what can I put on. I'm very proud of myself for getting in the shower. I ate the stuff that I cooked. The semester is over, and I really feel like this is a slippery slope. This is a very slippery slope right here that, if I don't fix, will mess up a lot of things. So basically...
So I'll stop it there. She describes one clear symptom of major depression, sleep disturbances, and possibly fatigue. So she might be experiencing hypersomnia, where she has a hard time waking up in the morning, or she might be experiencing fatigue, where she just doesn't feel like she has the energy to get up out of bed and do things. She also alludes to appetite impairment or disturbance, so having to kind of force herself to eat what she made. So this is just kind of an example of how depression isn't always necessarily obvious in the way that someone looks or talks. But for the person experiencing it, it can just really feel like everything is much harder and it's effortful and not very rewarding to go about your daily life. Okay. So major depressive disorder is diagnosed when low depressed mood lasts most of the day, nearly every day, for at least 2 weeks. And to get this diagnosis, you have to have low mood, either sadness, so depression, or anhedonia, which kind of refers to the lack of positive affect, so not really enjoying things that you used to enjoy. It's referred to often as loss of pleasure. And sometimes people will refer to it as just feeling kind of emotionally numb and flat. They might not even really feel sad, but they don't feel capable of feeling happy. So in addition to those mood symptoms, low mood, you have to experience at least 4 other symptoms out of a list of 9 that includes low mood and anhedonia. So 4 of the other 7 symptoms are sort of, I would classify them as a little bit more physiological. This is the effect that depression has just on your body's physical functioning. Really common in depression are appetite changes, either increase or loss, changes in sleep, so insomnia, not being able to fall asleep or stay asleep, or hypersomnia, sleeping a lot more than usual. Like I said, it's rare, but some people with depression experience psychomotor agitation or retardation, and there's a video of someone demonstrating that a couple slides from now. And then people with depression often experience fatigue and low energy. The other 3 symptoms of the 7 are more about how people are thinking and how they're experiencing themselves. So very common in depression is feeling worthless, feeling really low self-esteem, feeling really guilty and feeling like you're being punished even if you didn't really do anything wrong. as I mentioned, depression can influence cognitive functioning. It can make it really hard to think clearly or to engage in effortful thinking. People who are depressed can feel really indecisive. They just like feel stuck and can't make basic decisions. Or they might have difficulty concentrating or difficulty thinking. So depression can really impair your performance at school or work because it's just harder to think clearly and think at your usual level. And then lastly, the other cognitive piece of depression is recurrent and persistent thoughts about death or suicide. So to meet criteria for this symptom, someone doesn't necessarily have to even want to kill themselves or have a plan to commit suicide. They might just be really preoccupied with thinking about the fact that they'll die one day or thinking about the fact that their loved ones will die one day. Or they might have what's called passive suicidal ideation, which is just kind of wishing that you were dead, wishing that you wouldn't wake up in the morning, wishing that something would happen that would kill you, but not actually wanting to actively take your own life. So anhedonia, everyone knows what it feels like to be sad. Sadness is definitely one of those symptoms that we talk about a lot that exists on a spectrum where most of us are somewhere in the middle in terms of how often and how intensely we experience sadness. Anhedonia can be a little harder to relate to if you haven't experienced it before. So I'm going to let this guy explain what anhedonia feels like to him, and also what brain fog and difficulty concentrating can feel like.
Here's the deal. For me, sometimes it's hard for me to separate brain fog from anhedonia because it almost feels like all of my emotions and pleasure sensations, like they're there. I can recognize them, but it's almost like they're behind a shield. And there is a difference between brain fog and anhedonia because there's sometimes I can feel just totally out of it, can't even form a sentence correctly, but I feel a good sense of well-being, and it's like, okay, I guess they are different, but it's a really confusing kind of a thing that really scrambles my brain to think about sometimes. The best analogy I have come up with to describe what anhedonia feels like is that, as a metaphor or as an analogy, whatever, if one part of my brain is responsible for generating emotions and feelings, and another part of my brain is responsible for putting those feelings and emotions into effect for me to experience it, it's almost like someone installed a muffler as a middleman, so everything's watered down.
So that's one way that people experience anhedonia, just kind of feeling like their emotions, both positive and negative emotions, are kind of muted or flat. Another maybe more specific definition of anhedonia is the inability to feel pleasure when good things happen, or just not being able to enjoy activities that you used to enjoy in the same way. And as we'll talk about later in this lecture, all of these depression symptoms, with the exception kind of psychomotor retardation and agitation, do exist on the spectrum and on a continuum with normality. So everyone probably can relate to like being bummed out or sad about something negative that actually happened and having a hard time being cheered up, like not wanting to do fun things as much as usual because you're sad. But when someone's experiencing clinical anhedonia, doing something fun or something really positive happening, like even something as positive or great as like getting a great job or winning the lottery, wouldn't make them feel happy for any significant amount of time. It wouldn't change their mood state. It wouldn't elevate their mood. So another first-person perspective is from the, I think, now defunct webcomic Hyperbole and a Half. And this is the creator's sort of autobiographical depiction of a depressive episode that she went through. So this is a sort of humorous depiction here of feelings of guilt and worthlessness, feelings of low self-esteem. She sort of depicted her internal monologue, sort of berating herself, scrutinizing and hating every basic thing that she did, and also being really mad at herself and really frustrated for feeling sad in her mind for no reason. So she wrote, "It's disappointing to feel sad for no reason. Sadness on that normal spectrum, normal continuum, can be almost pleasantly indulgent when you have a way to justify it. You can listen to sad music and imagine yourself as the protagonist in a dramatic movie. But my sadness didn't have a purpose. listening to sad music and imagining that my life was a movie just made me feel kind of weird because I couldn't really get behind the idea of a movie where the character is sad for no reason. So we'll talk about this more in the next lecture, but when people are depressed, they often are really frustrated with themselves for being depressed. And Stephen Fry articulated this too. Like, you want to tell yourself to snap out of it, and you're kind of mad at yourself for not being able to. And that is tied in with the depression symptom of feelings of guilt and worthlessness. Another great depiction of depression in like media is the Netflix show BoJack Horseman. Like I said in class, I tried to find clips that really depicted depression symptoms, but it was hard to do because the show kind of as a whole really shows like what living through a depressive episode looks like just day to day. So I highly recommend it. It is really sad though, so it's actually a really depressing show, but it's also great. But in this GIF, or not GIF, the non-moving one, the picture on the right of the screen, he sort of articulates his feelings of worthlessness as saying he feels like he was born with a leak, where the goodness he started out with just slowly spilled out and now it's all gone. So articulating feelings of emptiness, feelings of worthlessness, feelings of hopelessness about the future, because if all of your basic human goodness is gone, then, you know, there's nothing left. Like, there's no point to continuing. And that's kind of what he's articulating. And then in the moving GIF, the other character is talking about, similar to the cartoon in the previous slide, this like internal monologue, this negative self-talk, telling yourself that everybody hates you and they should hate you because you suck, basically. So depictions of guilt and feelings of worthlessness. Okay, so it was a little hard to find a good clip of psychomotor retardation because, again, this is like a very objective clinical phenomenon. It's really the only depression symptom that we don't diagnose purely based on someone's self-report. People with depression will often experience a subjective feeling of being slowed down or feeling like they're moving slowly or, feeling slowed down. But often that's really just tied into their fatigue, or it's because they're actually really tired from having insomnia. To diagnose someone with psychomotor retardation, you actually have to observe their behavior in the room and see that they're noticeably moving slowly. So when they walk into your office, they walk really slowly, they sit down really slowly. If they like tuck their hair behind their ear while they're talking to you, they do that abnormally slowly. But what the person in this video is demonstrating, I can't say whether or not her subjective experience is really psychomotor retardation. Again, it could just be fatigue, but if you watch her face as she's talking and pay attention to how fast she's talking, I think that she is demonstrating some psychomotor retardation in her facial muscles and her talking speed.
So I feel like everything's slowed down. I feel like I'm walking through treacle. I feel like I am just struggling to move around. Everything's slowed down. It's really weird. I'm trying to do things for the vlog and everything is just taking so long. Getting sentences out really hard. Remaining focused. The last few videos of the 31 days of PMDD was so hard.
So she's talking about subjectively feeling like she's slowed down, but she's also describing symptoms of fatigue, so just being too tired to do things, and difficulty concentrating. So having a hard time like finding words and doing her job, which is making videos. But again, like I said, she's also speaking really slowly. She's speaking in kind of a flat tone, so she's not using the vocal muscles that you need to use to have inflection in your voice. And that can be a sign of psychomotor retardation. So just her sort of flat, expressionless face, her lack of affect in her voice, and the kind of slowed down speed at which she's talking. I'm not saying that she has psychomotor retardation, but that could be what psychomotor retardation looks like. She is saying that she has it though. She's self-identifying as having it. Okay, so those were just some examples of depression symptoms, and they're there because I think that for a lot of people, it can be easier to understand what someone with an anxiety disorder is feeling like, even if you don't have an anxiety disorder yourself, because again, everyone knows what it's like to be scared of something, and most of us have experienced anxiety at subclinical levels. But whereas we've also all experienced sadness at subclinical levels, we may not, hopefully don't relate to feelings of guilt and worthlessness or psychomotor retardation or anhedonia. Those are some of the, I don't want to say more specific, but those are symptoms that are more associated with a depressive episode. Okay, so persistent depressive disorder is a separate diagnosis from major depressive disorder. And whereas to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, you have to have a depressive episode that lasts at least 2 weeks. For persistent depressive disorder diagnosis, you have to have symptoms that last at least 2 years. So another difference besides the duration, because a major depressive episode could last 2 years, although that's rare, is that persistent depressive disorder symptoms tend to be a little bit more mild than major depressive disorder symptoms, and you can meet criteria for PDD with fewer symptoms. So PDD is characterized by depressed mood, which includes either or sadness and anhedonia, and 2 or more symptoms in addition to that. So whereas with depression, or with major depression, you need to have 5 out of 9 symptoms to get the diagnosis. With persistent depressive disorder, you only need to have 3 out of 8, because psychomotor retardation is not a symptom of persistent depressive disorder. So in addition to needing fewer depression symptoms, the symptoms themselves can be milder for someone to get this diagnosis. And key examples of this are, whereas one of the cognitive emotional symptoms of depression is feelings of guilt and worthlessness, for persistent depressive disorder, this is described as low self-esteem. So you don't necessarily have to feel like a bad person or like you don't deserve good things to happen to you. You can just kind of have a milder but very long-lasting sense that you're just not as good as other people. That's sort of what low self-esteem, that's the psychological definition of low self-esteem. And then suicidality is not a listed symptom of persistent depressive disorder, and neither are thoughts of death and dying. Instead, it's described as hopelessness about the future. Double depression is fairly common for people with persistent depressive disorder, and double depression just refers to, in someone who meets criteria for persistent depressive disorder, developing major depressive disorder. So going from chronic mild depression to a shorter but more intense period of meeting full depression criteria. And when people recover from their depressive episode in double depression, they don't return to euthymic mood, they return to mild depression, persistent depressive disorder. If any of you guys have heard of the term dysthymia before, that's what this diagnosis used to be called before DSM-5. So a third unipolar diagnosis that is also distinct and separate from major depressive disorder is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So PMDD refers to affective symptoms, so mood symptoms, that are limited to the week or 2 weeks prior to getting your period, and that start to resolve during your period and are basically gone by the week after your period. So to meet criteria for PMDD, you have to have at least one affective emotional symptom, and that could be affective lability, which refers to mood swings. Lability refers to instability and frequently changing. The mood alteration could be irritability and anger. And I just want to add, going back to the depressive disorder criteria, that irritability, in the DSM, the way it's written is that in a child, irritability can replace sad mood as a diagnostic symptom of depression. But there's actually plenty of evidence that adults with depression experience a lot of irritability too. And if you remember, irritability is a diagnostic symptom of generalized anxiety disorder. And not in this lecture, but in the following lecture, we're going to talk about how similar GAD actually is to MDD. So even though irritability is a diagnostic symptom of PMDD and not technically of major depressive disorder, irritability is very common in major depressive disorder too. So affective lability, mood swings, irritability or anger, depressed mood, and also anxiety. Any one of these four would cause you to meet criteria for PMDD if you also experienced more physical cognitive symptoms. So one of them can be loss of interest in activities, which is also known as anhedonia, or concentration difficulty, appetite changes and food cravings, insomnia or hypersomnia, and lethargy, which is really similar to fatigue. So these four here are all overlapping symptoms with major depressive disorder. Not a symptom of major depressive disorder is feeling overwhelmed, and that feeling might be more closely related to the anxiety and emotional lability symptoms of PMDD. And then also physical symptoms that people often get with their period, like bloating, tenderness, joint pain, cramping. So if you have period symptoms in the context of affective symptoms and these other changes that are consistent with depression and mood disorders, that can cause you to meet criteria for PMDD. So the important takeaway from this is that even though PMDD includes some symptoms that aren't diagnostic symptoms of depression, major depressive disorder, there's a ton of overlap. So with PMDD, it can be really difficult to distinguish it from just depression because people aren't great at reporting on their past mood symptoms. It's just hard to remember what day your depression started, how long it lasted, whether you were really as depressed as you thought you were, especially if you're talking to someone who's currently depressed. People who are currently depressed have recall biases where they remember themselves as being more depressed in the past than they may have actually been. And also, because PMS, premenstrual syndrome, is kind of a more mild version of this, it's a very common experience for people who menstruate. So someone who is just depressed with major depressive disorder will often feel worse when they have their period, but that's normal. The symptoms have to really exceed what is normal for premenstrual syndrome to meet criteria for PMDD. So when PMDD is diagnosed based on just people's recall, so interviewing them one time, the rates are a lot higher than the rates that you get if you actually have people track their symptoms over 2 full menstrual cycles to make the diagnosis. So 6% of people who menstruate will say that they think that they experience PMDD, that they have depression symptoms that only occur before and during their period and go away the week after. But when those same people actually track their symptoms and track their cycle, only about 2% of people, so 1.8%, meet these criteria. And then of those, not all of them actually endorse sufficient distress and impairment from those symptoms to meet criteria for a diagnosis. So only about I think about 1% of people who menstruate, which is 1% of about 50%, so 0.5% of the population actually meets criteria for PMDD and doesn't have any other mood disturbance. So this is someone talking about her experience with PMDD and how she kind of distinguishes it from depression and also from PMS.
PMS times 1,000,000. I'm Augusta, and I have something called PMDD. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or PMDD, is an extreme form of PMS that includes severe physical and behavioral symptoms. When I first realized that I had it as a teenager, I was just convinced that I was bipolar or really depressed. I felt like I was an intangible because I couldn't put myself in one box one way or another. I was captain of cheerleading, I was in honors classes, I was in theater, I was in, all these things. And it's all happy all the time. At home, I was wow, I'm extremely depressed. In this video, you're gonna see I'm really happy and I'm really upbeat, and that's because I'm not in the part of my cycle where PMDD is affecting me. If we were filming this when I was in my PMDD cycle, I guarantee you it would be a different version of myself. It's not the happy me. It's the me that doesn't have energy or is just feeling really depressed and sad and low. The big thing is that like PMDD is when it hits, it's not something that you can really see, and it's not something that's like immediately perceptible. It's why people don't know that other people have it or know that they have it, but it is this like bit of conflict inside of myself. If you don't know what PMDD is, picture PMS times a million. Extreme emotional and physical highs and lows. I'd laugh so hard that I would actually like start crying, and then I would just get really sad about, I don't know, I just like felt sadness and hopelessness really deep within me for no apparent reason. It was just like a feeling that overcame me. The physical part of it is that because your hormones are changing at whatever time it gets triggered. For me, like my boobs are really sore for like 3 weeks before my period, which if you do math is 75% of the month. I would get really bad migraines. Like I started tracking it and I would get migraines like 12 days before my period every single cycle. So PMDD for me is really extreme highs and lows or exaggerated emotions and physical feelings and things before your period. So when I was 15.
Okay. So this video goes on and she talks a little bit more about what her experiences are like and how she sort of can tell it apart from typical mood swings, emotional lability, which again, everyone experiences to some degree, and PMDD. And really the main difference is that PMDD happens every cycle, and it's markedly more intense than what many people who menstruate experience.
Which was branded as the PMDD.
So we're going to focus more on depression treatment in the next lecture, but with PMDD, there's a treatment option that's unique to this diagnosis, which is going on hormonal birth control that regulates or stops your menstrual cycle. So that treatment works for a lot of people, but there are plenty of people who can't tolerate hormonal birth control or don't want to be on it for whatever reason. So other treatments for this disorder exist, and they're basically the same as treatments for major depressive disorder, so antidepressant medications and cognitive behavioral therapy. When women who experience PMDD get pregnant, they tend to be at higher risk for perinatal mental health problems, so mental health problems that start during pregnancy and continue for the year after pregnancy. And they also are more prone to getting depressed when they go through menopause. Okay, so PMDD and PDD, persistent depressive disorder, are separate diagnoses from major depressive disorder. Seasonal affective disorder is a subtype or sort of a specification within the diagnosis of major depressive disorder. And seasonal affective disorder is basically major depressive disorder that follows a seasonal pattern where people experience recurrent episodes of major depression or even just one episode of major depression that happens during the winter months and that spontaneously remits or improves when spring comes. People with seasonal affective disorder tend to experience certain types of depression symptoms more often than others. And one of the most common SAD, seasonal affective disorder symptoms, is hypersomnia. So sleeping a lot more than usual and particularly having trouble waking up in the morning. People with SAD also experience increased appetite and weight gain. So what you're looking at with this figure is these are people who have seasonal affective disorder being asked, what is the worst month for you mood-wise? And you can see that the worst month for most of them is January. But people start having their worst month in like October, November, and people's best months tend to be during the spring and summer. And then along with just having your worst mood symptoms, people also tend to socialize least during this time. They tend to gain more weight, eat more, and sleep more. So those are all core symptoms of seasonal affective disorder. But the main thing that distinguishes it from regular depression is that regular depression can happen at any time. Seasonal affective disorder is when depression happens, not just when it happens to happen during the winter, but when it happens during the winter and improves during the spring. So that suggests that it's actually tied to the change in seasons. And more evidence that this type of depression is tied to change in seasons is that it only happens in places that have seasons. So in places close to the equator, seasonal affective disorder doesn't happen. And there is some evidence that the prevalence of seasonal affective disorder does increase as you go further north, but not in a linear way. And basically once you get north of like the northern United States, but in Europe, that's like north of, I don't know, Switzerland, there's no linear relationship between how far north you are and the prevalence of seasonal affective disorder. But that being said, that does mean that in the United States, there is kind of a north-south trend in the frequency of seasonal affective disorder, where it's more common in like New England and the upper Midwest than it is in the mid-Atlantic, and not very uncommon, but much less common in the deep south. So overall, the average prevalence of seasonal affective disorder is anywhere from 3 to 10%. For whatever reason, and we don't know why this is, it's higher in North America than it is in Europe. Seasonal affective disorder is also rare in indigenous people who live in really far north climates. So this includes indigenous people who live in Finland, so in like northern Scandinavia, people who live in Siberia, and people who live in Iceland. Sorry, this is Iceland. And it's probably not that people there are like genetically different or better at coping with the change in seasons for a physiological reason, although they could be, because there could be some selective pressure for people who are better at coping with the seasons to stay living there. But it also probably has more to do with just cultural protective factors. So people who have lived in cultures that have always been based in really cold climates they have more sort of cultural skills for dealing with it. So, like everything else, seasonal affective disorder exists on a spectrum, and what's known as the winter blues is much more common than full-blown seasonal affective disorder. It's pretty normal for people who live in temperate climates, especially like pretty far north of the equator, to feel kind of bummed out in the winter, to just have generally lower mood when it's less sunny outside. And that doesn't always lead to full-blown depression. So I've already kind of alluded to the relationship with light, but basically our mood is very closely tied to the circadian system. And the circadian system is an internal clock that exists inside the human body. It's regulated by the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which is one of the areas where the brain controls the release of hormones into the body. So it's one of the ways that the brain regulates bodily functions that happen outside of the nervous system. And these functions include sleep, but they also include appetite, activity level, so how much energy we have, how much we want to be out and doing things, alertness, so how fast our brains are working, and also things like sex drive and social functioning. So basically all the things that are affected by mood disorders, not just mood, but sleep, appetite, activity level, cognitive functioning, all of it is regulated by the circadian system. And the circadian system, in turn, is regulated by light. So we'll get to this in another slide, but there is a definite relationship between electric artificial light exposure and the prevalence of seasonal affective disorder. And we know this from studies of old order Amish people who follow the Mennonite religion, but in a very orthodox way where they don't use any electricity. So Amish people are not exposed to artificial light during the winter like most other modern people are. And compared to other Mennonite communities who do use electricity, they have much lower rates of seasonal affective disorder. And we think that this is because they practice kind of normal seasonality, probably what humans did while we were evolving, which was we wake up with the sun and go to sleep with the sunset. So Amish people wake up earlier in the winter than they do in the summer. And they tend to go to bed earlier because they don't have light, electric light, to do things after dark. So what that means is that their rhythms, their day-to-day activities is what's known as entrained to the sunlight. Whereas for most people living in modern society, our routines don't change at all with the changing seasons. We just adjust to less natural light in the winter by using more artificial light inside. So seasonal affective disorder is a disorder of circadian functioning, and our circadian cycle is regulated by light in the environment. So one thing that light does to help our body basically know what time it is and know where we are in time is that light suppresses melatonin And you guys have probably heard of melatonin. It's a really common, popular sleep aid, but it's produced endogenously by our bodies, and production of melatonin starts when the sun goes down. But if you're in an environment where there's a lot of artificial light, especially blue light, like is emitted by computer screens and TVs, that can artificially suppress melatonin production. So your body won't start producing melatonin until you're really in the dark, which could be after you've already gone to bed. So people with seasonal affective disorder are extra sensitive to the effect of artificial light. And so they experience what's known as phase delay, where their melatonin production starts later than it's supposed to and continues later than it's supposed to, which is why they have trouble waking up in the morning. So the theory behind seasonal affective disorder is that excess melatonin production, in addition to messing with sleep, which it does even for people who don't have seasonal affective disorder, but for people who are vulnerable to depression, too much melatonin could have an impact on mood. So it could start with dysregulated circadian rhythms and messed up sleep, but then for some vulnerable people, it can continue into a mood episode. So like PMDD, because seasonal affective disorder has a specific cause, we also have treatments that act on that cause. So the first go-to treatment for people with seasonal affective disorder or people with any kind of circadian phase delay where they have trouble falling asleep and waking up at the right time is bright light therapy in the morning. So bright light therapy is supposed to mimic natural sunlight. And when people with circadian sleep disorders or seasonal affective disorder first wake up in the morning, like first thing, they're supposed to spend 1 to 3 hours in front of a bright white light. And this light is supposed to work by suppressing their body's melatonin production, which helps them naturally wake up and feel more energized. Because when melatonin is in your system, it makes you fatigued and sleepy and less physically active and less cognitively attuned. Sorry, and I'm not very cognitively attuned because it's late in the day and it's been a long day. So we know that bright light therapy probably works through this mechanism because there have been trials, and this is described in your textbook, where bright light therapy in the morning in people with seasonal affective disorder is compared to a control group who used bright light therapy in the evening. So bright light therapy in the evening shouldn't work because the mechanism of action is supposed to be that it suppresses melatonin production and helps you wake up in the morning. And it seems like it does that because people with seasonal affective disorder respond with improved sleep and improved mood only to morning light therapy, not to evening light therapy. So just like PMDD, cognitive behavioral therapy and antidepressant medications also work for seasonal affective disorder, but cognitive behavioral therapy plus medications or plus bright light therapy tends to have the most long-lasting effect. So treatment with just light therapy doesn't necessarily protect against relapse. So it might work as long as the person is using the light, but stop working when they stop using it. As we'll talk about in the next lecture, CBT helps people learn skills that protect against depression long-term. Okay, so the last mood disturbance, unipolar mood disturbance that I'm going to talk about in this lecture is complicated grief. Now, complicated grief is not a standalone diagnosis right now, but there's actually a section in the DSM that's devoted to what's known as disorders for further consideration or research diagnoses. These are diagnoses that we're actively studying as a field to see both, do these diagnoses help us identify subgroups of patients who have a different course or a different prognosis or a different response to treatment compared to patients with existing diagnoses? Do they identify people who are impaired, who are distressed, who are experiencing dysfunction, whose behavior is deviant, and whose behavior could be dangerous? So is it truly psychopathology? And then also the research is about trying to figure out where these disorders fit in to our existing network of diagnoses. And when it comes to complicated grief, it actually sort of straddles the line between depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. So grief looks a lot like depression, but unlike depression, everyone unfortunately experiences grief. Every person who dies on average leaves behind 1 to 5 people who are experiencing grief. So grief is a response to the loss of someone who is a major part of your day-to-day life. So usually those 1 to 5 people are parents of the deceased person, children, or the spouse of the dead person. There's a difference between grief and sadness. So it's normal to be sad when someone you know dies, but grief is really the experience of acute loss, of losing a really, really important part of your day-to-day life. So although grief and depression both obviously involve a lot of sadness and crying and low mood, what really distinguishes grief from depression is the presence of yearning. So just really longing for the person who's dead. Sort of similar to the experience of separation anxiety from a person who's alive, just like really, really desperately wanting to be with them and feeling really agitated and maybe inconsolable because they're not there. By contrast, what grief doesn't share with depression is like the complete lack of positive affect and the feeling of hopelessness and that life isn't worth living. Because unlike depression, grief, when it's acute, decreases over time. So grief is at its most intense and its most persistent in the 2 to 3 weeks after the loss. Over time, grief, even immediately after a loss, grief comes in waves. So there are times when it's really, really intense and really bad, but within minutes or hours, it gets a little bit better, and then it gets really bad again. So that's acute grief. Over time, the waves get a little bit less steep, so the grief is less intense, and they also get further apart. So the periods between the intense waves of grief, where people are actually capable of feeling happy and enjoying positive activities and having positive, non-distressing memories of the dead person, those periods get longer. By contrast, depression is really persistent. It stays at pretty much the same intensity level throughout the course of a day. And it really tends to involve the lack of any positive affect or emotion. So people who are depressed don't really get a break from depression in the same way that people who are acutely grieving tend to get a break from grief throughout the day. Grief also, it does share other features with depression. So there can be feelings of guilt and worthlessness in grief. But the difference between grief and depression is that those feelings of guilt and worthlessness tend to be focused on the relationship with the dead person. So in grief, the guilt might take the form of like not being there for them when they died or not being there enough for them in life. It could have to do with not feeling like you're worthy of carrying on their legacy, or you failed them in some way. So grief or guilt and worthlessness are focused on the relationship, whereas in depression, they're just really generalized. And then in people who are acutely grieving, there often are thoughts of death, obviously, like the same preoccupation with death and really thinking about and pondering death the way that depressed people do. But of course, in grief, those thoughts of death are really focused on the death of the person you're grieving. Or if there are thoughts of suicide, it tends to be focused on not wanting to live without them or wanting to die so that you can join them. Whereas thoughts about suicide and depression typically have to do with like feeling like you're not worth staying alive and that other people in your life would be better off without you. So that distinction helps disentangle acute grief from clinical depression. So most of these things I just covered, but one other important difference is that in depression, people tend to just sort of generally withdraw because the things that they used to enjoy don't bring them pleasure anymore. So they're not as motivated to do things, and they also might be feeling too fatigued. Whereas in grief, people don't typically have that energy loss, and if they avoid activities, it's because it reminds them too much of the dead person. So in grief, it actually looks more like avoidance that we see in anxiety because they're trying to avoid triggers for acute emotions. The avoidance is about negative reinforcement. It's about getting away from a bad feeling and not experiencing that intense wave of grief. Whereas in major depression, the avoidance is about a lack of reward. So they don't do things because they're not motivated to, because they're not fun anymore. And then another difference is that acute grief, also kind of like anxiety disorders, can involve intrusive images. So unwanted thoughts about the dead person that the person doesn't want to have because those thoughts cause a lot of pain. And similar to what happens in worry, people who are grieving might try to suppress those thoughts because they don't want to deal with the pain that they bring. but thought suppression doesn't work, so that makes the thoughts kind of rebound and come back stronger. And that avoidance and thought suppression process isn't present in depression. So we're going to hear more from Kay Renfield Jamison in the bipolar disorder lecture. She is a mood disorder researcher at Johns Hopkins. She's a professor, but she herself has bipolar disorder, and she's been really public about her experience with it, kind of taking a scientist's perspective on her own experiences. So here she's talking about how she could tell the difference between grief when her husband died and depression that she'd experienced before. So she said after he died, she didn't lose her sense of who she was as a person or how to navigate the basics of life as one does in depression. I lost a man who'd been the most important person in my life and around whom my future spun. I lost many of my dreams, but not the ability to dream. The loss was devastating, but not deadly. So as someone with depression, she is able to see the difference in her experiences because she's experienced both. So complicated grief is different than acute grief. Acute grief is universal and normal. And although it's unpleasant, it happens to everyone, and it's actually adaptive. It's a sign of, it's a healthy response to a loss of someone who is important to you. Complicated grief happens over the long term when someone is unable to integrate their acute grief into their daily life. So it happens when someone kind of gets stuck in that acute grief phase. And often it happens cognitively because the person's not able to come to terms with the loss. They're not able to sort of come up with a narrative that helps them explain it and understand it for themselves. So the prevalence of complicated grief is as high as 7% of bereaved people who've experienced a loss. And it's characterized by, like I said, a prolonged acute grief response. So there's no right amount of time to have acute grief. But for most people, the really acute stage of grief where it's intense and overwhelming and it might look clinically impairing, that usually doesn't last more than a couple weeks to a month. And it's not that people aren't really, really sad and grieving after that time, but they're past the stage where the grief is disabling. Someone who's experiencing complicated grief might still be having acute grief responses as much as 6 to 12 months after the loss, which is not typical. So in acute grief, people will have preoccupying thoughts, feelings of yearning, feelings of loneliness, feeling that life is meaningless. In complicated grief, that lasts up to as much as a year after the death or more. Again, as in acute grief, but in a prolonged way, people might really rearrange their life to avoid reminders of their loss of the person who died, or they might do the opposite. So they might have a lot of reminders of that person in their house, or they might have difficulty changing the arrangement of furniture in their house or getting rid of the dead person's things. And these two behaviors might exist in the same person and cause a lot of internal conflict. Grief and sadness are physiological responses, and like anxiety, that physiological response can become conditioned to triggers in the environment. So people who are experiencing prolonged grief can have intense sadness and grief reactions that are triggered by reminders of the dead person, that are triggered by intrusive thoughts. People with complicated grief can also experience what could look like sort of psychotic symptoms where they actually hear or see the dead person, or potentially experience the sensations that they think that person had when they were dying. Hearing and communicating with the dead is not necessarily a sign of psychopathology. It's normal in some religious traditions and some cultures. So this would only be a symptom of acute grief if it was happening in the context of all these other symptoms, and if the person didn't have religious or cultural beliefs that they actually could communicate with the dead. People with complicated grief might experience relationship disturbances where they withdraw from all of their other relationships. Also common in complicated grief is to develop separation anxiety towards other people in your life who you're close to. And then the cognitive piece of complicated grief is really inability to accept in your own mind that the person is gone. So you might forget that they're gone, and reminders that they are gone would be really distressing. You might feel shock and disbelief or numbness, just like the inability to really wrap your head around the fact that they're gone. Or what's also common is repetitive perseverative thoughts about the loss. So thinking like, what could I have done differently to prevent this? What must it have been like for them? Why couldn't I have been there? And these perseverative thoughts often happen because the death itself was unexpected or violent. So some risk factors for complicated grief at the environmental level or at like outside of the person include the circumstances. If the death was violent and unexpected, the relationship to the deceased person matters a lot. So most cases of complicated grief are in parents who lost a child or in someone who lost their life partner. And typically the dead person it was a positive relationship. It wasn't necessarily like a high conflict or like up and down tumultuous relationship. It was usually a source of a lot of positive emotions and social support for the bereaved person. So yeah, complicated grief, because the circumstances of the loss are often really tragic, and also because of the avoidance and the acute physiological responses that happen in it, it makes complicated grief resemble an anxiety disorder a lot, and specifically PTSD. Because PTSD, as we'll talk about, also has to do with difficulty integrating into your own mind, your own conception of reality, that a traumatic event happened. So people who have a pre-existing mood or anxiety disorder, who have that cognitive vulnerability and the biological vulnerability where they have intense physiological reactions and they're prone to conditioning, those are risk factors for developing complicated grief. So is having a history of insecure attachment. So again, if you're someone with separation anxiety who has anxious attachment where you're terrified of the people that you love leaving you and someone actually does leave you by dying, that can be really destabilizing for someone with separation anxiety disorder and that attachment style. Protective factors against complicated grief. One of the biggest ones is religion. So people who have a strong religious belief that there's an afterlife, or who have another kind of narrative that they tell themselves about the meaning of death, especially if they really believe that they'll see the person again, that can be hugely protective against complicated grief. It can really help people go through the grieving process and integrate the loss. What also helps is social support. So probably one big reason why complicated grief in children, adult children who lose their parents, is less common, besides the fact that adult children often have other relationships besides their parents that they get a lot of social support from. So they're not losing their main source of social support when their parents die, like you might if you lose your partner. There's also just a lot more camaraderie in losing your parents as an adult. So it's something that a lot of people go through. And so there's more like scripts for how to deal with it. You've seen other people go through it. Other people who've gone through it can help you out. And parents who lose a child and people who lose their spouse, especially people who lose their spouse at like kind of a young age when their peers haven't gone through that experience yet, going through that alone can be a huge risk factor for complicated grief. Okay, so that's like kind of the end of the section on the unipolar depressive disorders and manifestations of unipolar depression. And in the conversation video with Lorenzo Luaces, one of the things he talks about is the evolutionary basis, or sort of the adaptive purpose of sadness and depression. And I think with anxiety, it's a lot more obvious where this emotion comes from and why it was adaptive for our ancestors. It's an acute time-limited response to a specific stimulus, something that's dangerous. And the behavior it promotes, like wanting to escape, wanting to run away, is clearly adaptive. So what is adaptive about getting depressed? So complicated grief, seasonal affective disorder, and PMDD actually help us maybe get some insights into what could have been adaptive about depression and sadness and grief for our evolutionary ancestors. So one theory about the adaptiveness of depression and what sort of typical adaptive behaviors depression is a pathological outgrowth of is the resource conservation hypothesis. So the idea here is that when someone experiences a loss, when someone living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle experiences a loss, especially a social loss like a rejection, a breakup, separation from a loved one, or grief, loss, bereavement, that loss wasn't just emotional, it might have also been a physical material loss where you lost someone who helped you survive and helped you gather food and eat. In the case of PMDD, you're not losing a relationship or a person, but you're losing iron and blood. So your resources are literally depleted. So it may have been adaptive for our ancestors who were in those situations, who had a big social loss, or who were menstruating, or who were living through winter when there's less available food and it's not safe to be out for a lot of the day because it's darker. It might have been adaptive for people going through those experiences to kind of engage in what Dr. Loases in the video refers to as illness behaviors, where you act like basically a sick person, where you sleep a lot, you have changes in appetite where you might not eat, or you might eat a lot to try to conserve your resources. You kind of just lie around, you don't expend a lot of energy. All of those behaviors could have been adaptive for our ancestors to try to conserve energy and resources in times when they were scarce or threatened. Another adaptive function of sadness, so some of the more cognitive, like feelings of guilt, feelings of worthlessness, or behavioral, so crying, looking sad, being slowed down, those behaviors could elicit caretaking in other people. So humans have a natural caregiving response to someone who's crying, based on our response to infants crying. So our ancestors who went through a loss, like bereavement, or an interpersonal loss like a breakup, acting sad around other people could have actually been a good way to elicit caretaking. So at a time when their resources were depleted, by acting sad, they might have encouraged other people in their community to step in and help them out. So people who engage in these behaviors, these illness behaviors like fatigue, sleeping a lot, changes in appetite, and sadness behaviors like crying, feeling bad about yourself, those people might have had a survival advantage at times when resources were limited, like when they're going through grief, when they're menstruating, or in the winter. But there's no direct evidence for any of these theories, and as Megan Williams talked about way back in lecture 2, it's easy to sort of tell stories based on what we think our ancestors' environment might have been like and what behaviors we think might have been adaptive, but we don't know for sure. This is just more of a hypothetical exercise that actually can be, clinically, it can be helpful when giving a depression diagnosis to try to help patients understand where these behaviors that they often are really ashamed of or confused by, to help them understand where those behaviors are coming from. Whew, okay, this is close to the end. And I didn't get to this in class, so this is all new information. Okay, so this is a place where I'm going to disagree with the textbook and give you information that's not in the book. So the textbook says that the lifetime prevalence of a major depressive episode, which most of them happen in people who have major depressive disorder or a unipolar depressive episode, but a small percentage of them also happen in people with bipolar disorder. 2% of, according to the textbook, 2% of major depressive episodes are in people with bipolar disorder, and the other 14% are in people with unipolar depression, PMDD, or persistent depressive disorder. So that's the textbook statistic. I am arguing that that statistic is outdated. More recent research has actually suggested that the prevalence of depression is much higher than that, as high as 50%, but at least 30%. And the 30% is actually similar to the prevalence of anxiety disorders. So it's an open question whether anxiety or depression is the most common form of psychopathology, but they're both extremely common. And I'm going to argue that depression is much more common than the textbook will tell you. So why the difference between the research I'm citing and the research that's cited in the textbook? Well, the study that I'm citing, the series of studies at this point, were longitudinal. So these are studies that took advantage of data sets like the Harvard longitudinal adult development data set that we talked about in lecture 3. So data sets where people were followed for a really, really long time. In the case of the Harvard data set, followed from early adulthood to death. In studies like that, that's where the prevalence of depression is higher. And in studies where that 16% figure come from, the way that data was collected was taking people at one point in time, asking questions about depression to see who's currently depressed, and then asking questions about lifetime depression to see who's ever been depressed in their life, even if they're not depressed right now. And the problem with that is that people are not very good at remembering when they were depressed. So like I said with PMDD, people's memory for depression can be a little bit foggy, both because it's just hard to remember like what you were doing 10 years ago and how you were feeling in general, but specific to depression, your current mood state can influence that a lot. So if you're currently depressed, you might be more likely to look back 10 years in the past and say like, yeah, I think I was depressed then too. Whereas if you're happy right now, if you're euthymic, it means that you're less likely to interpret your past self as having been depressed, because people who are depressed have negative interpretations of the world, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. So recall bias and current mood state is one reason why longitudinal studies are more accurate than cross-sectional studies of lifetime depression prevalence. Another depression-specific reason is that depression actually affects memory formation. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture too. But depression is neurotoxic. The longer it lasts, the worse your memory formation can be. So when you're in a depressive episode, you might not be forming memories that are as detailed and specific as the rest of the time. And it could be for reasons related to cognitive impairment and memory impairment that's caused by depression. But it could also be incidental to depression, because when someone is depressed, they're doing less, they're not going out, they're not socializing, they're not engaging in fun activities. And fun activities and relationships are the way that most of us remember the past. So like when I try to remember what I was doing 10 years ago, I was a junior in college. So I would try to anchor my memory on like, who was I hanging out with then? What was my job? What classes was I taking? Like, what was my family doing? And if I was depressed at that time, I might not have been engaging with my friends. I might not have been going to class. I might not have been going to work. So it would have been harder for me to remember anything about that time in my life because I wouldn't have events to anchor on. So that's another reason why retrospective reported depression is not accurate. And then the last thing is that depression is actually one of the easier diagnoses to get. You only have to have symptoms for 2 weeks. And by contrast, GAD, which is the most similar diagnosis we have to depression in terms of what the symptoms look like, you have to have those symptoms for 6 months to meet criteria for GAD. So most of us would remember if we had been consistently anxious for 6 months. It's a little harder to remember if you were consistently sad for 2 weeks. So it turns out that in these longitudinal studies, if you ask someone at time A, have you ever been depressed in the past? And are you depressed right now? If the answer to both of those is no, you follow them for 10 years. And then 10 years later at time B, you ask them again, are you depressed right now? And have you ever been depressed? The answer might be no again. But if you followed up with them throughout that 10 years, say every 6 months, and asked, are you depressed right now? Were you depressed in the last 6 months? When their memory for a shorter time period might be better, they actually might have met criteria for depression at some time in those 10 years and not even remember themselves at the 10-year assessment time point. So studies like that actually help, they help researchers make educated guesses about how accurate people's memories of depression are. So we know that people's memories of depression aren't that accurate. So another reason why the prevalence of depression is higher than cross-sectional studies would suggest is that fully half of people who have a depressive episode will never go on to have another one. And 75% of depressive episodes last less than 12 months. Most of them last less than 3 months. And again, they can be as short as a week. So if you just have a single depressive episode, there's a 50% chance that you will not have another one in the next 20 to 30 years. 20 to 30 years are sort of the longest follow-ups we have right now. So half of people who have one depressive episode will never be depressed again. And that will also make it harder for them to remember when they're looking back because they don't have really anything to compare it to. So arguably, people who get depressed once, who meet criteria for depression once, get over it without any treatment and without ever being diagnosed and never get depressed again, are they really the same as people who are severely recurrently depressed for years of their lives? Maybe not, but they still meet criteria for depression. And if you catch them at the right time in your cross-sectional study, they could be part of that 16% of people who have depression, just because you happen to get them at the right time. But their depression seems really different from the depression of people who experience recurrent episodes, who experience episodes that last longer than a year, who experience episodes that are so severe that they are memorable. So I would argue that the likely lifetime prevalence of what we would consider real serious depression that doesn't go away on its own, like 50% of depression does, is somewhere between 15 and 25% of the whole population. So that's a higher range than the 16% estimate that your textbook gives you. And I would argue that that 15 to 25% of the population might be different people than the people in that 16% estimate, because that 16% estimate includes people who might be going through their first and only minor, brief depressive episode. And this is kind of a complicated concept, and it's hard when data conflicts. It's hard to reconcile that. So it's, I think, important to remember that compared to the anxiety disorders we just talked about, major depressive disorder is a lot more heterogeneous. It's a lot more variable. One depressed person looks very different than another depressed person, whereas pretty much everyone with panic disorder kind of looks the same. They have the same symptoms, the same behaviors, the same experiences. They're all equally unlikely to get better on their own. Whereas with depression, someone could have a minor, brief episode and never be depressed again, whereas another person could have depression so severe that they physically can't even move around, have psychomotor retardation. So the takeaways from all this stuff about epidemiology is that many of us will have depression, will meet DSM criteria for depression at some point in our lives. For about half of people, it's a one-time thing and it goes away on its own. I would argue, and Lorenzo Luaces, who we're about to hear from, also argues that maybe those people don't really have psychopathology, because it's not very deviant if 50% of people have it. It's not that distressing or dysfunctional if they don't even remember that it happened. But for about half, depression does recur, and the highest risk of recurrence after a depressive episode is in the first 2 years. People who do have recurrences tend to have a lot. So on average, between 4 and 7 in their lifetime. And that's, again, over those 20 to 30-year long-term follow-ups. And about a quarter of people with recurrent depression have more than 6 episodes. And again, those episodes can last anywhere from 2 weeks to years. So depression is extremely variable. So there are at least 225 ways to meet depression criteria based on the combination of symptoms that you have. You have to have at least 5 out of 9, but you could have just 5, you could have all 9. And as Dr. Luaces says in his video, a lot of the depression symptoms are actually like opposites. So you could have either insomnia, not sleeping, or hypersomnia, sleeping a lot. You could lose your appetite completely, or you could be hungry all the time. So since the symptoms of depression are so variable, and there's 227 different combinations of them, it's really easy to think that maybe those different patterns of symptoms might distinguish groups of people who have a meaningfully different diagnosis. So what would make the differences meaningful would be if the pattern of symptoms you had predicted your prognosis, so how likely you are to get better on your own, your course, so how long your depression is likely to last and how likely it is to recur, and your response to treatment. So whether you'll respond to antidepressant medications, to CBT, to electroconvulsive therapy, or whether you might respond to a placebo. So one way that symptom heterogeneity is recognized in the DSM is the difference between what's known as atypical depression and melancholic depression. Atypical depression is what we've been describing in people with seasonal affective disorder. And it's maybe your more, even though it's called atypical, it might be like the more stereotypical image that we have of what people look like when they're sad and depressed. Sad, crying a lot, sleeping a lot, overeating, eating comfort foods. These depression symptoms are also called neurovegetative. And vegetative is kind of what it sounds like. Like this is the type of depressive behavior that might have been adaptive for our ancestors when they just needed to like take a break, chill out, conserve their resources. By contrast, melancholic depression is really more characterized by anhedonia, so just like a total lack of responsiveness to positive stimuli, the inability to ever feel positive. It can have really severe symptoms like psychomotor retardation. Fatigue is common in both of these, but what's really specific to melancholic depression is not just insomnia, but specifically early morning insomnia, where people can fall asleep at night, but then they wake up like 3 or 4 hours before they want to wake up every morning. So that diagnosis is or that distinction is recognized by the DSM. They're not different diagnoses, but they're specifiers. So when you diagnose someone with depression, if they seem to have one or the other of these patterns of symptoms, you would give them the diagnosis of major depressive disorder with melancholic features or with atypical features. So personally, like intuitively, it seems to me like these differences should matter because it really makes a huge difference in what the patient looks like and what their experience is, whether they're crying all the time and overeating versus absolutely flat affect and not sleeping and not eating. Like those experiences seem really different. So in our guest lecture today, I asked my grad school friend and colleague, Lorenzo Luaces, who studies the heterogeneity of major depression, if different combinations of depressive symptoms actually indicate that someone will have a different prognosis, course, or response to treatment.
Most people who have depression don't get the diagnosis by needing identical symptoms, right? So you only need 5 out of 9, but out of those 5, most of them have in the criteria 4. So for example, the first symptom is sadness or depression, but you could say like, okay, well, sadness and depression, they're kind of like conceptually, like they're very similar things, right? You can also have it go in the opposite direction, right? So appetite is like you can either be overeating or you could be undereating. It can be either actually at the behavioral level or it can be you're eating the same, but you just have to force yourself to eat. So like your appetite is lower, but you're still doing the same. So you can see even how that introduces some level of heterogeneity.
So he said 177.
Most of my research.
It is actually 227, just to clarify. He was not including the dichotomous distinctions within symptoms in that 177 estimate.
Who have depression don't get the diagnosis by needing
Oh, sorry. Okay, so 227. Not going to test you on that.
In most of my research, what I found is that the severity of the symptoms matters, which makes a lot of sense, of course. The type of symptom, it usually doesn't matter. Sleep maybe matters a little bit, psychomotor retardation, which is a little rare. That degree of involvement from like the motor system, that makes me think, well, that really does seem like it's something else. So I'm not saying the symptoms don't matter at all. They haven't mattered a lot to treatment yet, but it's possible that they mean something else, like what genetic comorbidities the person has, or what's the appropriate coping, and maybe that says something about the treatment. It's a little bit complicated by the fact that when people have symptoms of depression repeatedly, they often don't meet the same symptoms that they met the first time around. So it's not like if you are a person that thought suicide the one time, that you're highly likely to think about suicide next. So that we have these subtypes that are about symptoms, they don't seem to be very stable across time. And so that also kind of makes me wonder, well, how do we do more of this?
Okay. So takeaways from that video. There are a lot of different combinations of depression symptoms that could cause someone to meet criteria. But according to research, it actually doesn't seem like those symptom level differences really make a huge difference in predicting someone's prognosis, the course of their illness, or their response to treatment. And importantly, symptom combinations themselves aren't stable over time. So people tend to have recurrent depressive episodes over the course of their life, between 4 and 7 for most people. And each time they meet depression criteria, they tend to meet depression criteria with totally different depression symptoms. So it's not like a type of person who gets atypical depression versus melancholic depression. There are a couple exceptions to that though. One exception is that people who get seasonal affective depression, seasonal affective disorder, do tend to have atypical features every time they get winter depression. If those people get depression at other times of year though, they might have different symptom clusters. And then, although, as Professor Lavoisier said, symptoms themselves don't seem to make a huge difference, symptoms do correlate with severity, which does make a difference. And specifically, melancholic features, especially early morning insomnia, so early morning awakening, and psychomotor retardation, those both tend to occur in people who have more severe depression overall. So symptoms matter a little bit, but what seems to matter more is severity, chronicity, and recurrence. So when it comes to severity, the majority of people who have depression, who meet criteria for depression, have either moderate or severe depression. And we'll talk in a second about what that means. But remember that what it doesn't mean is that people who have severe depression don't necessarily have more symptoms. You could have 5 out of 9 symptoms and either have a very mild presentation where you have sad mood, but your mood is sad in the sense that you're less happy than you usually are. You could have loss of appetite where you have to force yourself to eat. Food doesn't taste that good anymore. It's harder to go to sleep at night, so you're getting maybe 6 hours instead of your usual 8. And you feel really guilty, like you're not being good enough at your job. So you have depression, but if it's not significantly impairing your day-to-day functioning, if it's just making it a little harder to get out the door in the morning and go about your life, that's mild depression. You can have those same 5 symptoms, but to a much more severe level where you're so sad that you're crying all the time. Life doesn't feel worth living because you think that you're just an awful person who has no goodness inside of you. You have absolutely no appetite and you're losing weight because you can't force yourself to eat. And your early morning insomnia is so bad that you're only getting 3 or 4 hours of sleep every night. So same symptoms, much different level of severity. So chronicity refers to how long a depressive episode lasts. And as I said, 75% of depressive episodes last less than a year, or they're gone within a year. However, about 15% of people, when they have their first depressive episode, that episode lasts more than 2 years. So they have chronic persistent depressive disorder. That's not the normal course. So most people recover from their first depressive episode within 3 months and the majority within 6 months to a year. And again, these are first episodes. So the statistic that 75% of depressive episodes last less than a year is also true, but it just includes first, third, fifth, seventh, and 10th depressive episodes all in that same estimate. But interestingly, when people have recurrent depressive episodes, their first one tends to be the longest. I mean, yes, the first one tends to be the longest, and then subsequent episodes typically last less than 3 months. And then recurrence. So again, 50% of people who have one depressive episode don't go on to have another one, and about 50% of people go on to have recurrent episodes. So severity, chronicity, and recurrence all do make a difference in determining someone's prognosis. So specifically, chronicity and severity both predict poorer response to treatment. So that kind of makes sense. When someone's sicker, it takes more to get them better, and they might not respond to the treatments that we have. Interestingly, though, chronicity and severity also both predict less response to placebo. So in lecture 3, we talked about how common placebo responses are, and in depression, they're actually really common. So at least 30% of people with depression will recover no matter what treatment you give them. But the more chronic their depression is and the more severe their symptoms are when they're treated, the less likely they are to respond to a placebo. And the bigger the difference between their probability of responding to a placebo and their probability of responding to a real treatment. So they're less likely to get better overall, but if the treatment works, it's more likely to be the active treatment that works. Severity doesn't actually predict relapse, but both recurrence and chronicity do. So when someone has more chronic depression or when someone has had more recurrences in the past, they are more likely to relapse after recovery. And actually, persistent depressive disorder, which is super chronic, but usually fairly mild, actually has one of the worst relapse rates. And just in general, chronicity, whether it's treated or not, it predicts the most prolonged course. It tends to predict the worst outcomes, less response to treatment, longer course of illness, less likely to spontaneously remit. So, like I said, depression severity is not about how many symptoms you have, but about how intense they are. So one of the main ways that we measure depression severity is with self-report, and this is the most common self-report instrument. So the Beck Depression Inventory has 21 items, each range from 0 to 3, and each item asks about how intensely someone is experiencing a depression symptom. So one depression symptom is feelings of guilt and worthlessness, and one way that people express this is saying that they feel like a failure. So you could range from feeling like you failed more than the average person, which would be a mild depression symptom, to feeling like a complete failure, which is a more severe symptom. So there are score ranges on the Beck Depression Inventory, the BDI, that help us determine whether someone's depression is mild, moderate, severe, or very severe. Another way of measuring depression severity is with clinical interviews. And I'm just going to play a little bit of this clinical interview to give you a sense of what depression diagnosis looks like. His bedside manner is not the best, but that's because it's not a real patient.
Were you afraid that something bad's going to happen?
Yeah,
How was the sleep?
it's not that good. I wouldn't sleep on it.
In one day, in the 24-hour period, how many hours of sleep did you get?
3 to 4 hours.
3 to 4 hours? Was it difficult for you to fall asleep? Sometimes. And how many times did you wake up at night?
Well, sometimes every hour.
How many hours did you used to sleep before when you felt better? 8. And now how many?
3
3 to 4. So you lost like more than half of your sleeping time. And how is your appetite?
It also varies. There's when I'm anxious, I'll eat a lot, and when I'm depressed, I don't have it.
So both ways. You are sometimes sometimes you lose your appetite and sometimes you eat much more. And how does food taste to you?
Pretty tasteless. I'm depressed. I can really get the flavor of food.
So,
Okay, so that was just a little taste of a common depression interview. And there he was asking about appetite and sleep. But interestingly, he was also asking about anxiety, and depression interviews and rating scales do ask about anxiety because depression and anxiety really go hand in hand. Even people who don't meet full criteria for a comorbid anxiety disorder tend to experience elevated anxiety when they're depressed. So when we're doing an interview like that, we're asking these questions in sort of a semi-structured way. We're not reading a script, but we are comparing the person's responses to a set of criteria. So essentially, rather than having them fill out a form themselves, like the BDI, we're sort of doing that for them with their responses. And usually we'll do both. So we'll have them report their symptoms on an inventory, like the Beck Depression Inventory, and we'll do a clinical interview. So this is an example of assessment where she already has a depression diagnosis, but he's doing an assessment to see how severe her episode is. Okay, so that is the end. Next lecture is going to focus on etiology, so the biological, cognitive, psychological, and environmental risk factors for depression, and how we treat unipolar depression. So basically, the main takeaways from this lecture is that mood disorders are complicated. We don't understand them as well as we understand anxiety disorders, and they affect pretty much every area of functioning. So it's really, mood is really a misnomer because mood disorders affect appetite, they affect sleep, they affect energy level, they affect cognitive functioning, they affect social and interpersonal functioning. Unipolar mood disorders are also extremely heterogeneous, and part of this is because it's relatively easy to get a depression diagnosis. So our diagnosis is encompassing people who don't have a very severe illness, and maybe even people who don't have an illness at all, who might just be experiencing normal sadness. But depression varies a lot in symptom combinations, chronicity, recurrence, severity, and seasonality. And that variability is still not super well understood. So when you watch the full conversation video with Dr. Loases, he talks about that and about how he is trying to understand heterogeneity in his research. Okay, so yeah, let's have that be the end for today. And I will see you guys in class on Tuesday.